In the US context, the biggest advocate of backdoors to encryption is the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which is the lead law enforcement agency in the United States. Never in human history has law enforcement had more access to more communications of more people than they do today. This is the golden age of surveillance, if anything. Imagine you're trying to buy something online and you can't be confident that when you send your credit card information to the merchant, it's not going to end up in the wrong person's hands. Remember, that communication doesn't just go to the merchant, it bounces around on the internet and makes a number of stops. When you use WhatsApp, for example, there's got to be at least 100 million WhatsApp users in Pakistan, I would imagine. When you use WhatsApp, it's encrypted end to end. Nerd harder, as we say in the US. Well, people have been nerding about this for decades, and they haven't come up with a solution that's better than this, which is allow for people to use end-to-end encryption.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Digi Pod. My name is Fariha Aziz. Today I'm joined by Greg Nojeim, who is a senior counsel at the Center for Democracy and Technology. Greg, thank you so much for joining DawnNews English. We've read obviously about the Salt Typhoon attacks and the advisories that have ensued, sort of underscoring the need for encryption. But I have also read your comments on how anti-encryption advocates have, advocated for backdoors to encryption. Now, could you, for the audience who may not be aware of what the Salt Typhoon attacks are and what the encryption debate has been, just contextualize it for them, and what kind of debate has that triggered in the United States?
Thank you so much. And Fariha, it's a pleasure to be here and to join you on this podcast. Really, it's a pleasure. So Salt Typhoon is an attack on U.S. telecommunications carriers such as AT&T and Verizon, in which China or representatives of China have gone into those networks and have inserted malware that could be used to make it so that information is extracted from those networks. Now, the extent of those attacks is not yet fully understood, but what is understood is that it's the worst attack on telecommunications carriers in the United States in history. That has prompted the federal agency that is responsible for securing critical infrastructure like the backbone of the internet, which is run by these companies. They have been told to beef up their security and to make it less likely that hackers from China or elsewhere can cause this kind of problem going forward. One of the things that they recommended was that people who believe they might be targeted because they work at a high level at one of these companies ought to employ encryption and ought to use only messaging services that are encrypted end to end. And in the guidance that they issued, this is the Cybersecurity and Information Security Agency, and the guidance that they issued, they extended that recommendation to regular people as well who are not thinking they might be targets. This is a game changer in the United States because typically government agencies involved in law enforcement have been advocates of attacks on encryption. And now we've got one coming forward and saying, boy, we better encrypt.
How do you see this? I mean, which would appear as a contradiction, and you've also commented on this. And backdoors has been a topic of conversation, with the NSA revelations and others. How has encryption been treated typically, especially by law enforcement? And in Pakistan also we tend to hear, oh, but we do need access because there's a terrorism problem, there are national security concerns. How do you see this in the U.S. context presently?
In the US context, the biggest advocate of backdoors to encryption is the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which is the lead law enforcement agency in the United States. The FBI FBI directors have, the last three of them have been strong advocates of a requirement that companies build in backdoors. They don't call it a backdoor. They call it responsible encryption. But in fact, responsible encryption involves offering a product that would allow law enforcement to gain access to the communications used over the service that that product features. And that's a backdoor. So they don't call it backdoors, but it is a backdoor that they're advocating. And security professionals, computer security scientists have been working on this problem for decades, and they have concluded that it is impossible to build a backdoor only for the good guys, only for law enforcement. That if you build in a vulnerability that law enforcement is meant to use to gain access, it will leak out and others will gain access to, including the bad guys whose crimes you're trying to prevent. So the FBI, its theme is we're going dark because so many people are encrypting their communications now. We can't read them. This is a false narrative. Never in human history has law enforcement had more access to more communications of more people than they do today. This is not a going dark situation. This is the golden age of surveillance, if anything.
What is it? I mean, like you're saying that this is a golden age of surveillance, there are privacy concerns. How do you see the encryption debate, not just in the United States, but you're also part of the Global Encryption Coalition? Encryption, again, if we were to just to explain to the audience, right, requiring, and they may not call it backdoors, but encryption advocates refer to these as backdoors. How does this essentially, I mean, what is the purpose of encryption? Does it defeat the purpose of encryption if you're building in access to whosoever it may be? And sure, there may be concerns, but like you say, that it's a surveillance, sort of intro. How do you reconcile the concerns, but also maintaining privacy in today's day and age?
So the gold standard for encryption is called end-to-end encryption. That means that a communication is encrypted so that only the sender and the intended recipients can access it. A backdoor, and a communication is encrypted when it is scrambled, so that if it is intercepted in transit or intercepted from storage while encrypted, what the interceptor gets is gibberish. They can't understand it. The proposals that we've seen around the globe nowadays don't typically say, hey, we're law enforcement, we need to have a backdoor to encryption. Instead, the proposals are out there to address very serious and necessary to address social problems. For example, protecting children online, making it so that obscenity isn't sent. These are legitimate goals, and we cannot ignore the need to protect children and to combat obscenity. But the solution that's been proposed so often from law enforcement, which is, hey, to fight these crimes, we need access to everybody's communications. And so there has to be a way for us to get in, defeats encryption and defeats the protection that we all count on. Imagine you're trying to buy something online and you can't be confident that when you send your credit card information to the merchant, it's not going to end up in the wrong person's hands. Remember, that communication doesn't just go to the merchant. It bounces around on the internet and makes a number of stops. It's really important that that communication be encrypted. And if it's not, if there are ways to access it along the way, well, you've got a very insecure internet. You've got a bigger cybersecurity problem than we already have. And you could have economies slowing down because people are afraid to use the internet because they can't count on encryption. We all count on it today. We don't think about it. It just happens naturally. When you use WhatsApp, for example, there's got to be at least 100 million WhatsApp users in Pakistan, I would imagine. When you use WhatsApp, it's encrypted end to end. And it's important to be able to use that and to count on that when you're sending messages. Other encrypted services include iMessage from Apple, Signal, and they're not all created equal. They're not. And the reason I say that is because although encryption will protect the contents of a communication, it often doesn't protect the metadata, who you communicated with, when, for how long. That information is needed to transmit the message. So for most systems, it can't be encrypted. And the different providers of encrypted messaging services retain or do not retain metadata differently. And among them, from what I've seen so far, Signal is the one that retains the least amount of metadata and is probably therefore regarded as at least as secure or more secure than the others.
Signal definitely is regarded as more secure amongst the more privacy conscious. And I'm just wondering how law enforcement, especially in terms of requesting metadata, even if it's not content communication, because law enforcement requests also for data is something that we see in a lot of transparency reports. There are spikes. And what level of receptivity is there to the arguments made by people like yourself and privacy advocates for end-to-end encryption and communication privacy? Because ultimately, as you said, a vulnerability for anyone is going to be a vulnerability that can be, it's exposed and can be manipulated and used by anybody.
I would say we're making progress. There will never be a complete victory for encryption, but just looking at the trend nowadays, more and more communications are being encrypted end to end. The trend is not mistakable. It's happening all over the world. At the same time, we're facing more and more proposals that could compromise encryption to address those social ills that I talked about earlier. For some of these proposals, the proponent will say, well, okay, you're telling us that we're not able to build in a backdoor just for law enforcement. You computer scientists, go figure this out. Nerd harder, as we say in the US. Well, people have been nerding about this for decades, and they haven't come up with a solution that's better than this, which is allow for people to use end-to-end encryption, have law enforcement use other tools to gain access to communications, count on things like user reports of illegal content, count on things like access to metadata, count on things that are not going to defeat our ability to communicate privately with each other.
And certainly, it has a global impact because these services are being used around the globe. There are different political situations that are being faced, especially whether it's journalists, political dissidents, and it has a disproportionate impact on marginalized communities as well, where communications privacy is concerned. Finally, just to end, Greg, is there anything that you would like to add or flag for the audience in terms of any policy debates that are taking place that we should, where encryption is moving or where anti-encryption advocacy is moving and what we should be wary of?
Yeah, I think there are a number of encryption hotspots around the world. People who live in these hotspots and follow the issue know about it. If you don't follow the issue, you can go to the website of the Global Encryption Coalition, www.globalencryption.org, and you can follow it there. Hotspots include all of Europe because there are proposals to require the platforms to address harms to children, harmful content. And how do you address harmful content if you can't read it because communication is encrypted end to end? There are proposals in the UK, in Australia. In India, there's the traceability issue, which is also a challenge for encryption, about which I wrote a few years ago. And maybe it's happening in most countries outside of Africa. Interestingly, in Africa, where we have more members than any other place in the world, in Africa, there haven't been a lot of anti-encryption proposals of late, at least that have been brought to the attention of the coalition.
That's interesting. So there are several legislative or policy proposals that are afloat, and of course, a lot of times various governments will rely on harms. And while we're cognizant of harms that do take place, there has to be some sort of striking of balance and also understanding that technology works in a certain way. And we can't leave everybody exposed to those vulnerabilities, and more safety and more privacy is the need of the hour versus less. Craig, thank you so much for making time for DawnNews English today.
Thank you.